Hi guys, it's Mrs. Beggs, and I am here today to read you a book. This book is going to go with our gardening theme. The title of it is Yucky Worms. It is by the author Vivian French. It is a work of fiction, so it is made up from her imagination, but it's pretty cool because it has a ton of nonfiction within it. So it has a ton of facts that we're going to get to learn throughout this story. So, Yucky Worms by Vivian French. One day when I was in Grandma's garden, Grandma dug up a slimy, slithery, wiggly worm. Yuck, I said. Throw it away. Throw it away? Grandma looked horrified. Would you throw away one of your friends? You can't be friends with a worm, I said. You can't even tell which end is which. Yes, you can. Watch. Grandma put the worm down. It gave kind of a squirmy wriggle and disappeared really fast, pointy end first. As the rounded end vanished, Grandma said, "There goes its tail." I bent down to look and I could see it had left a little tunnel. Where did it go? I asked. Home, Grandma said. It's an earthworm. It lives underground. And then there's a little area up here where it says, in most backyards, there will be about 15 worms in every square yard of soil. And then at the bottom of this page, there is a diagram of a worm with labels. It says, "This is my mouth where food goes in." And then you have the brain, you have the esophagus, where the food goes next. Worms have 5 pairs of hearts. And then there's a thing called the crop, where the worm stores food. And then the gizzard, where the food is ground down. The clitellum, a pale ring found only on adult worms. Skin, which is covered in mucus for easier wriggling, and then the intestine, where goodness from the food is absorbed into the bloodstream, and finally it says, "And this is my bum where poop comes out." But what does it eat? Dirt? I wanted to know. It eats tiny, tiny stones and bits of dirt, Grandma told me. But worms eat other things too, like rotting leaves and flowers and fruit and dead insects. They especially like eating at night when it's cool. The stones and dirt help to grind everything up in the worm's stomach, and then the worm poops it back out. And then there's a couple of captions up here. It says, "Worms come above ground to find things to eat too. They pull their food back down as they wriggle into the ground again." Grandma pointed at the flower bed. "Look, can you see?" I bent down and I saw what looked like a weird, long, curly worm made of dirt. "That's worm poop," Grandma said. "It's called a cast. You know when you recycle things? Well, worms do it too. There's still a lot of goodness left in the things a worm eats. And when the goodness comes out again as poop, it helps plants to grow big and strong. And as the worms move around under and on top of the soil, the poop gets spread around the garden." That's why worms are my friends. Grandma gave me a thumbs up. And it's not just their poop that's good for plants. The tunnels they dig loosen the soil so roots can stretch out and air and rainwater can get in. And then there's a picture, and within the little worm tunnels, it has some facts. So it says, worms' poop is so fine and crumbly, it never blocks their tunnels. Then it says, in a square yard of soil, there will be about 4 yards of earthworm tunnels. Some people call worms underground farmers. And then finally it says, worms can wriggle backward and forward. But it's dangerous being a worm, Grandma said. I stared at her. Dangerous? I asked. She smiled at me. Lots and lots of animals think worms make the most delicious dinner. Birds love them, and so do moles, badgers, frogs, hedgehogs, and foxes. Even some slugs eat worms, and human beings accidentally slice through them with spades and spike them with forks. It's a tough life. Cutting them in half doesn't hurt them, Grandma, I said. They just turn into 2 worms and keep on growing. Grandma shook her head. Poor worms. Lots of people think that, but it's not true. She put her fork down. Time for a snack. And then there's a caption down here that says, a worm's tail can regrow if it's cut off, but cutting a worm in half will kill it. Grandma had tea and I had orange juice. Can I dig up a worm? I asked. If it rains, Grandma said, the worms will come up on their own. I took a cookie. Well, what if it doesn't rain? Grandma winked at me. We'll use the watering can and pretend. I finished my cookie as fast as I could. Can we trick the worms now? Here's a caption. It says, worms breathe through their skins. They don't mind the soil around them being wet, but if their tunnels are flooded, they come up to the surface to move around more easily. Grandma filled the watering can and I watered the ground. Then I stood back. I didn't want worms chewing at my shoes. They only put their heads out, Grandma promised, and it'll be a while before they do. Then we have a sidebar, and it says, when it's very hot and the soil gets too dry to slither through, a worm will wriggle down to where the soil is still damp, curl up, and wait for rain. When it's very cold, a worm will wriggle down even deeper below the frost level and curl up with other worms for warmth. Grandma dug her fork in the ground. Up came lots of dirt and wriggly worms. She picked one up and washed it in the watering can. Mustn't drop it, she said. They can't swim. Grandma put the clean worm on some paper and held it near my ear. I could hear a tiny rustling noise. What's that? They're covered in little bristles, Grandma said. The bristles and their muscles help them move. And then at the bottom of this page, there's another diagram. It says, a worm has rigid muscles all along its body. To move, it pushes its front end forward. and uses its bristles to hold that end in place while the back catches up. The bristles on the back end keep the worm from sliding backward, while the front end tunnels forward again into the earth. I've got muscles too. I bent my arm so Grandma could see. If you've got so many muscles, she said, maybe you'd like to help me plant my sunflower seedlings. Okay, I agreed, and then I thought of something. When I go to school on Monday, I'm going to say that I've got lots of new friends. Good idea, Grandma said. But, I said, I might not actually say they're worms. Okay, and that's the end of our story, but it has some additional information here at the back that I'm going to read to you. It says, how to be a wormologist. Look for. So things to look for are worm casts in your garden or in the park, leaves sticking up out of the ground, and worms on the surface after it rains. The next section is experiment by. You can experiment by watering a dry patch of grass or dirt and watching to see if worms come up. Tapping on the ground to see if you can make a worm believe it's raining, or carefully digging up a forkful of dirt and counting how many worms you find. And then the last section says a worm in the hand. When you pick up a worm, remember to be respectful. A worm is a living creature. Check how it feels. Is it smooth? Is it slimy? Can you feel the bristles? Watch how it moves. Is it a youngster or an adult? Remember, adults have a clitellum, a yellow ring around their body. Put the worm back on newly dug soil and watch how it wriggles away. Always wash your hands after touching worms. And then it has a little index. All right. So that book, Yucky Worms, if we are talking author's purpose, which we have been talking and learning about this week, you would remember the PIE, persuade, inform, entertain, or express. What do you think the author's purpose for writing this text is? With it being fiction, it was quite entertaining. So one of the purposes was to entertain, but it was also very informative with all the nonfiction facts that the author included. So it would have a dual purpose or author's purpose. So it was to entertain and for information. So I hope you enjoyed the story about Yucky Worms.